All right, and I hope everyone is feeling refreshed with the extra caffeinated brains. And our next topic is shared social media services as alternatives to big social, even for governmental communication. And first, we have Mr. Jonne Arjoranta, who is a researcher at the University of Jyväskylä. He specializes in game studies and internet cultures, and he also runs federated social media. And then there will be a commentary speech provided by Mr. Stefan Lindström, who is Finnish ambassador for digital affairs. He's a result-driven business advisor, networker, and diplomat with 20+ years experience in branding, business export promotion, and building successful partnerships. He's a partner at 5 venture funds.
Thank you, Leena. As she mentioned, I'll talk about shared social media services. I think they can be part of a solution, at least to some of the problems mentioned already today, but they will also bring their own share of problems. So we get to decide which types of problems we like and how to approach them. The reason I'm here today is that I kind of wear 2 hats, more or less. I work as a researcher. My title is Lecturer in Contemporary Culture, which is very misleading, considering that I mostly do research. And currently I'm working in a project called Counterspeech, or vastapuhe in Finnish, where we try to figure out some of the problems related to online discussion and hate speech, and most of the solutions we talk about are not algorithmic, and instead we explore a variety of solutions and possibilities. But in addition to that, I also help run, or I administer the federated social media mastodontti.fi, which is an example of the type of solutions I'm going to talk about today. I'll mention a few words about that later, but I'll mention these 2 hats so that you have an idea where I come from and what kind of knowledge I base my opinions on, and why I choose specific types of solutions. Before I go to the solutions part, I'll mention a few of the problems. It might not be news to you, but it helps to set the ground so that we know what kind of problems we are talking about and how we might address them. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the top 5 visited websites are, according to SimilarWeb in April 2023, are Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I'm going to skip the top 2, but instead focus on these 3, which are, as you probably know, being here, the biggest social media sites, all US-based. And although they do differ in important ways, they do share some problems. And I'm going to focus on 3 of them that I think are at the core of the problems we are discussing here. So they struggle with moderation, how to deal with speech, different types of speech, what to allow, how to handle things they don't allow, and how to draw the limits for that. There is a rising problem with disinformation that has been plaguing different ways of different forms of social media for a while now, but it doesn't seem like it's getting much better. And finally, I want to underline that there is a business model here that I think leads to some of the problems, and I'll try to show how that happens, or kind of at least address where that problem comes from. If we start at the top, the first problem is related to moderation. And since Facebook is the biggest of them all, the elephant in the room, we can take examples of how they deal with it. So they moderate roughly 50 languages at 20 different sites. This is 50 languages of the 100 that are regularly used on Facebook, in addition to some other languages that are used but not that prominent on the platform. This means that they have roughly around 15,000 moderators for their 3 billion users. That comes up to one moderator for 200,000 people, which is significantly better than they were doing in 2009 when they had one moderator for every 10 million users. Of course, the solution they try to offer for this is based on AI, which has already been discussed here, and with all the problems related to that. Eventually, these decisions, when they are difficult, come down to people. And these people are paid roughly 10% of what Facebook employees make. They typically live somewhere else than US and work in really rough conditions. That means that this work is not highly valued, and perhaps because of the rate and the conditions they work in, there are a lot of errors. As Kobler and Cox, writing on Vice, put it, Facebook is still making tens of thousands of moderation errors per day based on its own targets. And while Facebook moderators apply the company's rules correctly, the vast majority of the time, users, politicians, and governments rarely agree on the rules in the first place. So I think that this kind of summarizes it nicely in that they have two problems. One problem is that they make errors, and the second problem, which is probably the bigger one, is that there's a disagreement on what these rules are and what they should be. This leads to well-established cases where these kind of norms around moderation clash, like, for example, what happened in Norway. It's not clear that Facebook should be able to determine what the rules globally are. For example, in this Norwegian newspaper article, Aftenposten, they used a picture that is one of the most famous wall photographs in existence. But it also happens to contain a naked child, which is, according to Facebook, against their policies. So this picture got taken down, and the Aftenposten account was suspended, which means probably maybe this video will be taken down as well by YouTube once they get to this part. Let's see. So they wrote back to Facebook, specifically Mark Zuckerberg, saying that I'm writing this to inform you that I shall not comply with your requirement to remove this picture. They stood behind the kind of journalistic values that they value and argued that Facebook is in the wrong and they should be able to do their journalism. Eventually, Facebook did unsuspend their account and allowed them to continue doing their work, but it kind of highlights how these norms are not equally agreed on everywhere, and it might cause some problems when they are kind of pretending that they are sharing the norms with the global community and trying to moderate everything based on that. They are not acknowledging the cultural and historical specificities of the cultural differences around the world. This is one example of that, but I think for our cases sufficient to kind of work as an example here. Of course, Facebook knows this, so they're trying to create structures where their paid moderators don't have to solve these problems using two tools. First, AI, and importantly, other people. If you look up Facebook help pages, they have loads of guidelines like this. They're in this business, meaning that they do their best to externalize these problems to the users themselves. So this is a page from a guide on how volunteers on Facebook can grow their Facebook group moderation teams. Building and growing your moderation team, as they write, is made a problem for the users themselves, not for the company, who would have to pay for that labor. This is, of course, made worse by the increasing amount of disinformation available on these services. So if we look at some statistics on this, it seems that at least in people's experiences on how often they encounter disinformation, has been steadily increasing. In 2019, 62% of the respondents felt that there was a fair extent or great deal of fake news in online websites and platforms worldwide. In 2022, of course, not entirely comparable, but these are respondents from the EU member states say that 70% say that they totally agree or tended to agree with the statement. They often came across news which misrepresented reality or was false. Of course, there's two different phenomena going on here. There's the prevalence of false information online, and that is a problem for the social media sites, but of course there's a decline in trust in news in general, which is more of a problem for the journalistic side of things. But maybe this is enough to establish that disinformation is at least a problem, if not a pressing problem. What makes things slightly worse is that it seems that not all of these platforms take the issue seriously. So the European Union currently has a voluntary rule book on how to address disinformation on social media sites. So it also has guidelines on other issues like how to track political advertising, how to stop the monetization of disinformation, and how to provide access to outsiders. So transparency. And Twitter has recently decided to no longer comply with the rule book. This is a problem because of the disinformation itself, but also because these EU rules will be made mandatory at the end of August this year, when the new Digital Services Act comes into play. This means that to operate in the European Union, Twitter will need to comply or face fines. It seems that there's also the political will to hold them accountable for this problem. As France's digital minister recently stated, Twitter, if it repeatedly doesn't follow our rules, will be banned from the European Union, which might make them consider their stance. This is a problem, but it also highlights another problem where this policy on disinformation was pretty rapidly and radically changed in the past year, mostly because of the new Twitter owner, Elon Musk. So even if they had working policies in place previously, the new owner decided to change those policies, and because he is the owner, he has kind of the power to do that, which shows that even companies that were trustworthy in this sense might not be in the future. This is not a problem only for Twitter. Of course, Facebook was recently fined 1.2 billion for mishandling of user information. So we do have some laws in place or coming into place that will affect how these companies can operate in the European Union, but it still needs kind of regulatory work and also making sure that these regulations are followed, which isn't a given considering it took the Ireland privacy regulator years to handle this case. And part of this order is to either suspend the transfer of user data from the EU to the US or fix their policies, which might mean that these companies choose not to serve European citizens. They have 5 months to comply, so we'll see which the solution is. Finally, and I think this is the bottom line, these problems at least partially stem from how these businesses operate. It's not because they're evil, but because they have to follow certain guidelines or operate in a certain manner because they are built like that. And researcher Shoshana Zubov, professor from the Harvard Business School, has called this surveillance capitalism, which he defines in these 8 different ways. That's probably a bit too many for us. So for our purposes, we can use this simpler formulation. This is the kind of the first definition she gives: a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. To put it in slightly less academic terms, social media companies are businesses that need to monetize their users to make a profit. And currently, this happens through surveillance. So they are businesses that operate in a specific way, and therefore they will have to make these kind of decisions. Well, is there an alternative or a solution to this problem with the big social media platforms? And of course, I am here to argue that there is. And with the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Fediverse, which is a word that comes from federated universe. It is a social media platform unlike the ones we're accustomed to because it is decentralized in nature. There are thousands of different servers that talk to each other, not managed by the single stakeholder, but owned by different individuals, companies, societies, and different people around the world. And there are servers all around the world and users from most countries. There's no certain data about this related to how this data is collected, but at least we can say that most of the world is covered. This map that I'm showing you right now is based on where the data centers are located. So these might not be the countries where the users live in, and you can see that some countries are overrepresented because of their digital infrastructure. But this map does give you some idea on how the Fediverse is spread around the world. The reason this works, why this is possible in the first place, is that while these servers are all of different types, they talk to each other using the same protocol called ActivityPub. It is a World Wide Web consortium recommended decentralized social networking protocol, which is a mouthful to say, but it is basically an agreed upon protocol on how these servers can talk to each other. So all of the examples I'm showing you there are examples of these types of federated servers that together form the Fediverse. Now, to give you some, I already showed you some pictures of the servers, but to give you some sense of scale, I'll show you some numbers on the number of users. here's from the past few years. You can see that the number has grown steadily, but also that the biggest growth happened during last fall. And for a good reason, because that was when Elon Musk started seriously making Twitter unusable, and that was kind of localized within a pretty short time span of October to December, when a lot of Twitter users migrated. Now we're close to 10 million users, but this is probably unreliable because these numbers don't include all users. Since this is a decentralized network, there's no central place to get this information from. So these numbers are based on the servers themselves reporting the numbers of their users, and some choose not to, mostly for privacy or security reasons. But we can see that we're talking about roughly 10 million users. Now, we can also see that during that time, the activity of these people has constantly grown. The number of posts posted during this time has increased, and there's a upward trend there. First billion posts was reached this year, which is already probably happened slightly earlier considering the limitations of the data gathering. But I think we can, from the numbers, see that, well, Fediverse has more people than ever before, and they're posting more than ever before. But we can also see that what the big social media companies do have quite a lot of effect on what happens on the smaller platforms. All of the different types of servers I showed you earlier aren't equally represented in these numbers. If we break down these numbers according to server type, most of them are on Mastodon, which is something you might have heard before. It is a Twitter-like experience of using social media, simply decentralized and running on different servers. But who can you find on the Fediverse? What kind of people are there? For purposes here, I'll focus on not on the celebrities, which also are some there, but on the institutional examples. So the German Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information runs their own Mastodon server. Another big institutional server is run by the European Data Protection Supervisor. They actually run two. There's one for short form updates, like Twitter, and they call this EU Voice, and one for video, which is like YouTube, but federated, which they call EU Video. And on these servers they run, there are different accounts for their projects, like on the left you can see the German Institute for the Human Rights, and on the right the official account for the European Commission. Now, at this point you might be wondering, okay, this seems like a social media service, but why would the Fediverse be a good alternative to big social media services? How does it solve some of the problems that I mentioned, and possibly others? Well, I think one of the central strengths of Fediverse is the standard. It is a technical strength in that using this open protocol defined by World Wide Web consortium, these different projects can rely on the shared language and talk to each other regardless of how they otherwise operate. It is built on open standards, and key parts of the infrastructure, and most projects are open source and use a permissive license like the AGPL used by Mastodon, which means that I could make a different version of that and would be able to use that version. That means that it can be easily customized for different needs, maybe for an individual, maybe for an institution. And because of these open source and permissive licensing, it's not controlled by any one stakeholder, meaning what happened to Twitter cannot happen to the Fediverse, because there are always multiple stakeholders that can define how these projects operate. Because they use open standards and adapt different open source projects, mean that the existing infrastructure that institutions, companies, and governments have is probably already compatible with and can easily made capable of communicating in ActivityPub. I'll give a couple of examples of this later. And finally, because of the server structure, it also works as a built-in proof of identity, which is pretty important on internet, for example, after the widespread problem of Twitter identifying and verifying its users. You can probably do this already. Like if I show you the URLs of the different social media sites, the one run by the German government, social.bund.de, is run on the same URL as the German government organizations otherwise are running. So bund.eu, DE, I mean. And the server for the European Data Protection Supervisor runs on the same domain as all of the other EU projects, so europa.eu. In fact, if you look at the account for the European Union Commission, you can easily identify it coming from that address. It's probably a format you are quite well familiar with, because it's a similar format that we use with our email addresses. You kind of already understand how that works. This is only part of it. Of course, the protocol has other technical forms for proof of identity, which makes proving accounts more difficult. Now, a couple of other strengths, less technical in nature. Because the decentralized structure, that means that there is less users per moderator, and all the moderators are local to the server. That makes moderation much easier than if it is done by poorly paid people somewhere far away. Typical Mastodon server has hundreds or thousands of people, not billions, which means that you need less moderators and they can more easily recognize their users. The decentralized structure also means that the Fediverse is not dependent on any one particular service being very successful or capable of making money using this. So this won't go away if one company goes under. And because these different service types, there is no need to adapt to the format of a particular social media, like Facebook did for journalistic sources. Like I mentioned earlier, EU Vision uses Mastodon for short updates, while EU Video uses PeerTube for sharing long-form video. And because of the shared protocol, they interoperate. Now, I already showed you this picture earlier, but let's take a couple of examples of what it has. So the two services that I mentioned earlier, EU Vision is running Mastodon and EU Video is running PeerTube. But let's say we have an organization that wants to use these standards. They don't want to spend a lot of effort on doing that. They can adapt their old tools because they are easily open source based. Like, let's say you already use Nextcloud, Drupal, or WordPress, which are widely used by organizations, most websites run WordPress. So these already work with the ActivityPub protocol, meaning that organizations could easily adopt WordPress installations to serve this content on their social media services. Now, of course, like I said at the beginning, this isn't perfect. We cannot solve the problems of social media by simply changing protocols. There are challenges, but perhaps these are challenges that we prefer over the ones we currently have. So currently the situation is with most of the Fediverse servers that they are crowdfunded. There are thousands of different servers on the Fediverse, but someone needs to pay for the upkeep of these, maintenance of these servers. So this usually happens out of the pocket of the person running the server. It's not a lot, but it can add up. And the other alternative, of course, is to ask the people participating for money, which is what happens often. The decentralization also comes with some downsides. There are many servers, and sometimes it can be difficult to find the account of the person you're looking for. It's not enough to know what their handle is, like on Twitter. You also need to know which server they are located on. There are search tools, but they have their limitations. Servers can also use their moderation tools to stop communicating with other servers. This is mostly an upside, because this is a good moderation tool to make the Fediverse safer. But can also mean that some individual server admins can choose that their users don't see particular other servers or messages. That might be difficult in cases where you're trying to avoid bubbles. And since these servers are decentralized, moderation sometimes requires cooperation. There's still no clear guidelines or tools for doing this on scale. Most of the moderation people have done in previous examples have happened on centralized platforms. These tools for moderation are being built in real time as needed, and they are better now than they were, say, 5 years ago. But still, they are still being built. And finally, many of the ActivityPub-based projects are so new, they are not always technically mature, which is a problem if you want to use, say, a meeting app or sharing video or something. But at least Mastodon is probably the exception here, having worked for multiple years now. So based on these strengths and limitations, I have a suggestion on how this could work as a kind of platform or foundation for sustainable social media. Of course, we would need different servers provided by different stakeholders for different purposes. It is probably not going to work if all of these are run only by certain type of institutions or people. But I think the first step is to embrace decentralization, a world where we have a monopoly, or like in the current case, maybe a triopoly, is probably not sustainable in the long term. That's why we need different services. For example, government officials. Perhaps the police should have one. Maybe media has their own. And because these are all could run on the URLs and servers that are already recognized as official, they also work as proof of identity as being government organizations. Perhaps you could get official updates from the police by following different police accounts on a server running on poliisi.fi. They do run their Twitter accounts, but whether you see their updates these days is an open question. Technically, this would probably work best if administration and moderation would be shared between the different official servers. So I don't think every governmental branch needs their Fediverse experts, but perhaps having centralized servers while having the decentralized organization would work best. And of course, because we also need space for companies and commercial actors, perhaps they could run their own servers. For example, maybe all the journalists on Helsingin Sanomat get an account on hs.fi, and that way you can easily recognize them as journalists working for these organizations. Now, if you want to know more about these topics, I have a bunch of links you can easily follow, or you can easily ask me right now or a bit later. And I think now I'm going to give the floor to my commentator. Please take it away.
Thank you. A lot of thoughts. Where should I start? I think we all prefer a democracy instead of a democracy, as we have been shown what it really means when you do on this one. And I go back to a comment made by Timo Harakka this morning when he mentioned that data is the new oil. I beg to differ a little bit, because I've been using a lot of a metaphor like data is not the new oil, it's the new plutonium. And what do I mean by saying that data is the new plutonium? It's that if plutonium is used for something good, it's clean energy. If it's used for something bad, it pollutes our planet for the next 40,000 years, or it's a nuclear weapon. And data is exactly like that. If it's used in a wrong way, we have situations like manipulation, we have political movements like Brexit or Trump. But if it's used for something good, it's of course something that benefits our society as a whole. So think about that metaphor in a sense that data can be also used for something good in that sense. A lot of the issues here is also, they are in the very early stage, and another thing that is in its very early stage is Web3 and all the activities that is going on there, and it's going to change the business models of the platforms, it's going to change the way data is owned. So in the Web3, in the future, data is going to be owned by the producer and not actually by the platform. And that's going to be changing also a lot of the business models. It's going to be changed the sort of how data is dispersed between the different platforms, because what was suggested here is going to take place automatically in that as well. I'm going back to one big issue on this one. I'm going to place a few questions, and my big question is really about the moderation. Freedom of speech is a basic right that needs to be protected. And in this Fediverse, who would be the moderators and what mandate would they have to moderate content? Because, and on what basis would they moderate the content? What justification would they have to say that something is right and something is wrong? It's not only based on the fact that you don't agree politically, ideologically, and that's not a reason to be moderated out of the discussion, in a sense. So that is one issue that I find a little bit more complicated in this. Another point from a sort of governmental point of view, I mean the governmental arm, the Foreign Service that I work for, we are highly dependent on the platforms to disperse our information. And we are very active on Twitter, we are very active on Facebook, on Instagram. And why are we there? We are there because we can reach the audience. Facebook has 1 billion users on a daily basis. At this moment, I think Twitter is somewhere around 400 million daily users, while Mastodon is somewhere around 4 million users on a monthly basis. So we, of course, have to utilize those platforms in a sense. But having said that, we also, of course, are following all the kind of technological developments. Where can we be more effective? And how can we communicate more effectively? How can we reach the people that we need to reach? I dare to say that the audience, our target audience, the normal Finnish citizens, are many times incredibly lazy. They don't even go to our websites and look for information. They instead tend to go to different chat rooms and things like that and ask questions that they could easily Google and find from our websites that are secure and they actually provide the accurate information. We many times see that people are asking visa questions, citizens permit or different kind of permit questions on chat boxes instead or chat rooms instead that they ask us, which I think is kind of weird, because why don't you go to the source and ask instead of ask somebody else who gives you bad advice? And this we see time and time again. Where should we go next?
Maybe I can address some of that.
Yes, start, and then we can have an interaction on that one. Yes, please.
I think the kind of problems or the challenges you highlighted are exactly the kind of challenges that will need to be overcome if what I'm suggesting would become a more widely spread solution. So in order, moderation and where the citizens actually are. The moderation in federated services is federated, which means that all the different servers have different moderators, and they might have different kind of stances on what is acceptable and what is not. Of course, if we would have, say, instance for a server for the Finnish government, I would expect that to be very highly moderated and have very kind of strict rules on what is acceptable to say, based on the kind of the rules of discussion on those type of platforms and how people discuss their opinions in Parliament, for example. But the key to the problem of moderation is that because we have many platforms, users are able to choose the ones that have moderation kind of rules that are suitable for their needs, and because we have big enough instances that run by, say, government organizations, there are trustworthy people running those, that they know how the moderation will work in those cases.
But wouldn't that just create another echo chamber?
That is possible. If all users agree that they will together join a specific server that heavily moderates, say, I don't know, left-wing discussion, then all they would see would be discussions based on that. But that seems highly unlikely considering how people discuss online currently.
Yeah, the problem I have with it is a little bit like that when you demonize Twitter, for instance, in a sense, but at the same time you would be willing to jump on another server where you really don't know what is there, and anyone can form a server with one particular interest that would be moderated by people with one particular interest. In one way, maybe that would be even worse.
It is possible. The difference is that if you find Twitter objectionable, your only option is to leave Twitter. If you find a particular Mastodon server objectionable, you can join another one.
Yeah, it's a little bit like joining a Facebook group.
Yes, exactly.
In a sense, and having said that, Facebook groups was the prime reason for this vaccine debate in the world, because the Facebook algorithms actually drove a lot of traffic to Facebook groups, because that of course generated more clicks and it generated more income. Same thing with YouTube, that actually put forward all these conspiracy theorists as a suggestion. But I'm also thinking about that the traditional way has, of course, to disperse information from a governmental point of view has been called propaganda. And that has been one way. We tell you how it is. This is kind of the Chinese, the Russian way of doing it, and we don't accept any kind of other opinions on what we tell you. And now what we talk about, of course, in diplomacy is something what we call public diplomacy, which is a two-way street. It's engagement instead of just giving you information. And that's where I see that these kind of Fediverses can play a major role in many ways. The question is also that when we are seeing the competition in a sense of we have so many people out there that want to distribute false information or misinformation for their own benefit, it also means that we as a government, we as an institution, we have to be better at what we do in many ways and put it out, and we have to put more resources into it. So that's really the big issues here. But still we have to be where the people are, because they want to have something that is as easy to use as possible and as simple as possible. And when you can create something that is simple and easy, that's when you get to people, and that's when you get the right information to reach the right people.
Absolutely. The problem of where people currently are is, of course, something that is crucial to this discussion. It doesn't make sense to inform people in places where nobody listens. So what I would suggest is not a complete replacement for the current practices, but addition. If people say some decades ago would have said that we shouldn't use email because almost no one uses email, we wouldn't have the current ecosystem of being able to email to anyone anywhere around the world. And that is the kind of situation where I see the Fediverse being currently at the first step of possible wide adoption. And of course, whether that happens is an open question. The easy way for institutions to, at this point, to kind of try whether this works for them as a communication tool is to use their existing platforms like WordPress or something that already interoperates with these protocols and allows them to kind of talk to a new audience.
Yeah, I put a lot of hope now also in the new European legislation, DMA and DSA as prime example, the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Acts, that put a lot more pressure also on the global platforms to how do they handle the data, how do they transfer the data, and the definition of a gatekeeper, for instance. We haven't seen the implementation in place yet, in a sense that we have the first cases, but I put a lot of hope in this, because it's going to change the market dramatically in many ways and put a totally different kind of responsibility on them. So in that sense. And the eternal technological optimist that I am, I'm quite convinced that there's going to come new tech solutions that are going to replace the platforms of what we see today in many different ways. And they become faster, they become multi-platform. I don't know where we are going, but technology evolves so incredibly fast today that now when we also place these kind of restrictions with DMA, DSA, and also the Americans are putting their own tech legislation into acts, practical acts, in a sense that the big companies cannot buy out their competition anymore, meaning that small companies can come up and start creating new alternatives for that. So I also have to be the tech optimist to see that something is going on that side.
I'm slightly more techno-pessimist than you, but I also see the kind of these companies reacting to the current situation in trying to adapt to how, say, European Union is legislating them in the future, and one of the ways is trying these types of decentralized approaches. For example, Facebook is in talks of trying to build their own decentralized platform that would be
Barcelona.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is.
It's called Barcelona, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The original developers of Twitter also have their own Blue Sky where they're examining the similar questions. So I think the question of kind of interoperable protocols and possibly services that talk to each other is going to be one of the kind of future questions, but I think it's an open question what the answer will be.
Yeah, and it's also a question about how will the US regulate its the platforms. There are 5 legislative proposals put forward already 2 years ago, and there's just being talk right now, and I usually provoke my American friends saying that the only thing you do is actually talk, and then you outsource the whole sort of internet regulation to the European Union. And in that sense, that's a good thing, because I think the laws that we have put forward are citizens, consumer-centered, and goes on the basic needs and the rights of the consumer. When the laws are extraterritorial, they actually apply all over the world. The big thing for the companies is, of course, that they need to have a level playing field, that the same laws apply everywhere in the world. We are already now in a situation that one of the big companies I talked to, they said that they have to apply a law in Japan, and if they apply that law in Japan, they actually are in the breach of law inside the EU. So that's a sort of unstable, and it's not a situation where we can be. So the companies are also looking for sort of consistent legislation that actually can be applied on a worldwide basis, that they don't have to create these solutions everywhere. So it's really interesting to see also the US regulation. I previously ran the Finnish consulate in California for 5 years, and I spoke a lot at events, and many times I was attacked by people in the audience about speaking that, what do you Europeans think you are? You bring this GDPR, and it has only cost the industry $10 billion, and it's of no good use. And then, of course, you explain what GDPR is all about, and then after the panel, this very same person comes and talks to me afterwards and tells me that, I had to say that because my company asks me to do it, but personally I think that GDPR is really great. So I think DMA and DSA is going to bring similar kind of things. There's a lot of bubbling going on inside the companies, in a sense, because the people working in these big companies, they realize what they are working with, they see the results. It's not of a big surprise that the employees of the big platforms, they don't let their kids use social media, because they know how social media is manipulating people in a way to use it. We can see the nice movies that have been made about it, but that's another issue that we could talk about for ages, I presume.
Yes, better I don't get started right now. Perhaps we should take questions from the audience if there are any.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Tommi Kartavi. I'm a member of the Internet Society Finland chapter. My question is about moderation. So it seems to me that we are quickly coming to a kind of an inflection point where majority of the problematic content like disinformation and its dissemination is becoming automated. And at the same time, the same goes for the moderation side. It's also becoming largely automated. So essentially it's going to be like a cat and mouse game with AI against AI. Do you think this changes anything fundamentally? And if so, what are the implications largely and especially for the federated systems? Thank you.
So I think people underestimate the power of humans moderating things. When there are, say, on the server iAdmin, there are 4 moderators for around 1,200 people. That's generously enough to keep out spam and moderate all that, and that's way below the numbers that somebody like Facebook employs. So I think the problem of automated disinformation is less kind of bad if there are enough humans in the loop.
What we have to look at is also the figures. Nick Clegg told me in San Francisco that it's about 99.9% of the content of Facebook, of Meta, is taken down by algorithms. 99.9%. So they identify IP addresses, content, words, creations, and things like this. And still, we have millions of new accounts created every month that are dispersing this one. So the amount what is there is just mind-boggling. And it's virtually impossible to have a human to look at everything. I mean, if I see something negative on Facebook, I report it normally, but in also 99% of the cases, they don't react to it because the AI doesn't recognize it. I don't believe that a single human person has ever looked at one of the reports I make, which is a problem, of course. But it's also a problem of cost in many ways, of how do you get that? How do you get to a situation where you actually can have a human to look at all these issues? And that's also one of the reasons why it's so difficult to, if your account is being blocked, that you actually can get somebody to react to it. It's just the numbers issue is that you talk about such magnitudes that it's very, very difficult to make any sense of it. I think we had another question there.
Hey, my name is Raul Plummer. I'm with the Electronic Frontier Finland, and something attracted my attention, which you said, that how can we trust these news services instead of Twitter? And like, I think it's already since October or November when Elon Musk took over, you've come to realize that really anything is better than Twitter. You know that, I mean, there's been lots of cases where they actually shut down journalists there who are not to Elon Musk's liking. So I think really a leap into unknown is already better than what Twitter is at the moment. And I think Germany, seen in examples, has been the sort of the best lead on this, like to actually take the government offices into Fediverse. And I think whatever the way you look at it, it's really better than the alternatives are, which are commercial companies, have all these problems with their business plans and so on. So I think we should really join Germany in bringing the Finnish bureaus into the Fediverse instead of being in Twitter, where they can start to be charged for their services, and they can just be shut down if their message isn't to Elon Musk's liking.
Yeah, and the issue is also that when Twitter and maybe other platforms are setting up payments for the services, so then it's a question about equality, and that you only get visibility by paying. So then that's another issue that you have to deal with it. But it's like I said, we have to be, I'm looking at now from the sort of foreign ministry's perspective, is we have to be where the audience is. Having said that, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be open for other solutions, and I can tell you that it's been discussed many times. Where else should we go? How could we reach those people? That's really the key issue in it. What concerns me really about the moderation is, though, on the Fediverse, is that what are on what rules are the moderation being done? That's something that is there, and because, as I said, also freedom of speech is a fundamental value of the thing, and who decides whether something is misinformation and who decides what is right and what is wrong. We talk about facts, or we talk about alternative facts that we have seen on the other side of the pond.
I think I can finish by saying a short reply to that. If you join my instance, my server, then it's me. If you don't trust me, then you should probably not join my server. And of course, that applies to all services we use. Some of them are run by American companies, some people from Finland, and we have to make that decision in all cases. But I think we're out of time, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about this.
So thank you. This concludes the Finnish Internet Forum part, and now we will have another 30-minute break, and then we will continue with the EuroDIG program. Enjoy.